Transferring property from one owner to another is a simple matter in Canadian law. Returning land that was never ceded or that's currently privately held is quite another matter. With us now for the legal perspective on land back in Winnipeg, Manitoba, Brenda Gunn, academic and research director at the National Centre for Truth and Reconciliation. She's a professor at the University of Manitoba's Faculty of Law. And Brenda, it's good to have you on our program. How are you doing tonight?
I'm doing great. Thanks so much for having me.
Not at all. Let's talk about the logistics of land back. Do you think Canada's laws are sufficiently non-colonial, if I can put it that way, in order to, make this work?
Well, I think a lot of the solution that we need going forward is not for Canadian law to solve this problem, but rather for Canadian law just to simply get out of the way and recognize Indigenous peoples' own laws, customs, and traditions in relation to land. So I'm not sure if Canadian law can be anything but colonial, but I think we can ensure that there's space within the Canadian legal landscape to ensure that Indigenous peoples can continue to exercise authority over their lands.
Do you think it has a track record, Canadian law that is, does it have a track record of being able to, as you put it, get out of the way and recognize other types of law?
Well, we do have a few examples in Canada. Canada's a really interesting country because of the fact we have two very different legal systems that currently operate within it. The majority of Canada operates under the British common law system of law that follows the precedents of courts. But we also have in Quebec a completely different situation, and they follow the civil code. And this form of law is very different. I've been trained in the British common law, and that's the legal system that I understand. And I have no ability to practice in Quebec or understand how that legal system works. And that's fine, right? There's no problems that generally have come up over the last 150 years in Canada where we haven't been able to work that out. So I guess I feel like if Canada can be unique and have two very different legal systems operating, it's not that hard for us to recognize the space for Indigenous peoples' laws. And I guess I should specifically note Indigenous laws have continued to operate. They just always haven't been fully recognized by Canadian law.
So Canadian law can walk and chew gum at the same time.
I hope so. We've done it. And so we're only asking for Canadian law to continue to exercise that flexibility and recognize the space of Indigenous laws.
Gotcha. You mentioned the UK tradition that much of the country is based in right now. So let me follow up on that, because the notion of different types of ownership in England, for example, is a precedent for us here. The Crown has long-term lease agreements on some land and some home ownership, which means that certain lands might revert back to the Crown after a particular period of time, say 100 years or something. Is that a template for what could transpire as it relates to Indigenous law in Canada?
Well, I think we should be open to all sorts of options and opportunities in Canada to address the situation that we have. But we also must remember in many parts of Canada, we also have treaties that guide the relationship. And so, I'm not sure if we want to have land reverting back or if we want to come back to some of these historic treaties. For example, am sitting on Treaty 1 territory in Winnipeg, Manitoba, and that treaty was about land sharing. And so I think a lot of what we need to do as we think of solutions is also to come back to the promises and arrangements that were made at the time that Canada was setting up the state, and think about how can we fulfill those promises that were made in the 18 and 1900s and earlier, and have those be recognized today.
I take your point on that, but and let me give you the most famous example, and you tell me what you think. I mean, you can't give downtown Toronto back. You can't give downtown Ottawa back. It's too complicated. It's too difficult. I mean, we're going to get into the weeds a bit here, but what could you do short of doing that Indigenous people would consider to be fair compensation, fair trade, mission accomplished?
I don't know. Is it really too complicated to give Toronto back? Maybe. But Is there a way we can recognize in a really fulsome way that Toronto is Indigenous land? Is there a way for us to really reconceptualize Canada as an Indigenous land where we really start to think about the space that Indigenous peoples belong, right? And where we continue to have responsibilities over. I think there's a lot of opportunities that exist even within large urban centers to recognize and really share the space and live together in a better way. So, whether it be the small examples that I know of in Toronto, where some of the street names you were trying to revitalize Indigenous naming for
Mhm.
places. So I think a lot of what I see in urban centers is not necessarily just about changing the legal ownership of land, but recognizing Indigenous people's rights to those lands and that obligation that many Indigenous peoples feel to the lands, and think about how can we ensure that Indigenous peoples continue to be involved in caring for the land and making decisions for the land.
Well, every time somebody says the word Toronto or Ottawa, I mean, those are Indigenous words, right? So we certainly are aware of the fact that Indigenous people do have and have had claim to this area and the nation's capital for hundreds and hundreds of years. I mean, going beyond that, how would we compensate for treaties that have failed so far to be implemented and followed through on? What should we do?
Well, I think there's lots of examples. In Manitoba, for example, where we've had the historic treaties, there have been certain promises made, including setting aside certain lands specifically for Indigenous peoples' use. And, even some of those basic promises haven't been fulfilled. And so when federal land, for example, becomes available in an urban center, in Winnipeg, we had the example of the Capion Barracks. There's room and opportunity, even within urban centers, to have urban reserves and to have spaces where Indigenous peoples can continue to gather and exercise both their cultural traditions, but also engage in various forms of economic development.
Well, let me do another example from something here in the provincial capital. I mean, there's Downsview. There is land in Downsview that the federal government has owned for decades and decades and decades, and whatever was originally going on there isn't going on there anymore, and there have been numerous examples of what to do with that land. Are you saying that one of the options ought to be giving some of that land to Indigenous people and they take it over, they own it, they do what they want there?
That absolutely should be a consideration. And I no longer have attachment to Toronto. I no longer live there, but I would say, why not talk to the First Nations around there? Is there an interest in that? Is there opportunities? Is it a good investment for them to undertake responsibility and legal ownership of the land? And it should definitely be part of our conversation. It doesn't necessarily have to be, land back doesn't necessarily have to be Toronto, and we need to be more open-minded. We can't sort of go through the country and start saying, well, we can't talk about this area, we can't talk about this area, and take them off the board altogether. But we can be more nuanced and think more broadly on, okay, Toronto is complicated. So how do we start addressing it? And the lands that you referred to in Dansview could be a starting point for that conversation.
If nuance is required, does that suggest that expropriation by the Government of Canada on behalf of fulfilling its treaty obligations should be off the table?
It's hard to speak in large generalities. What I can say is, for the work that I've done in the First Nations and Indigenous communities that I've worked with, I haven't heard a lot of them asking for people's private home back. That's not really the goal. I mean, Indigenous peoples have experienced dispossession for hundreds of years. They know what it's like to lose their home. I don't see a lot of First Nations asking to put other people in that situation. But again, if we're talking expropriation, there's all sorts of federal and provincial lands in cities and in urban centers that aren't being put to use. Or we could think about shared ownership or transferring ownership. So, again, I think it's not that expropriation should be on or off the table necessarily, but looking at what are the aspirations of Indigenous peoples and think about how can we work within current ownership and create new opportunities to really recognize the deep connection that Indigenous peoples feel to the land and that is central to their cultural and physical survival.
Well, let me pick up on that. And we touched on this in the last segment, but you really are the expert in this. So I want to follow up with you on it, and that is UNDRIP, United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which Canada has signed on to. We are a signatory to that. So we are presumably obligated to fulfill the obligations that are a part of that. Can you help us understand how land back and fulfilling the obligations in UNDRIP, what the relationship is there?
Excellent. Yeah, I'm happy to talk about the UN Declaration. It is something I spend a lot of my time thinking about. So, the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, from my perspective, at its heart, is about shifting the relationship from a colonial one, where the government controls all aspect of Indigenous peoples' lives, to a new relationship based on mutual respect and partnership that is grounded in Indigenous peoples' rights to self determination. And when you go through and look at the UN Declaration, you see many references to Indigenous peoples' own customs, laws, and traditions. You see provisions that are related to Indigenous peoples' rights to their lands, territories, and resources. And interestingly, when you look at those provisions specifically in relation to land, the provisions are not just about owning and controlling and using the land, the sort of Western economic based perspective on lands, but there's also a provision about strengthening Indigenous people's relationship to land. And so when we're looking at the current situation in Canada, we really should be mindful of the fact that for many Indigenous peoples, at least where I come from in the part of the country that I reside and know most, Indigenous peoples have a strong connection to that land. They see the land and the resources as family, as relations, deep responsibilities for the land. The language and their way of knowing and thinking comes from the land. And so, given the centrality of land to Indigenous peoples knowing who they are and continuing to exist as distinct people, it's really important in Canada that we find ways to ensure that Indigenous peoples can continue to strengthen that relationship. And so for me, the UN Declaration in this work of land back in reconciliation is really critical because it reminds the Canadian government that, yes, they are a colonial government. They asserted control in a way that hopefully we would find no longer acceptable. And so the UN Declaration really provides us a way forward. While it recognizes the injustices and the human rights violations of removing Indigenous peoples from their land, it's really about how do we move forward. And so I think there is a strong obligation on Canada to begin to implement the UN Declaration, and that includes the rights that Indigenous peoples have to their traditional lands, territories, and resources.
We will continue to watch this with fascination, and we're grateful to you for your time in helping us understand it better. Brenda Gunn from the University of Manitoba, thanks for joining us on TVO tonight.
Thank you so much. Have a great evening.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.